always like that.
Good
And I think it's
gracious.
because, when the temperature changed a little and it was a little bit warm, it probably adjusted it. I don't know.
Shirley's taking
But
photos.
Doctor, I know. I asked if she would, and she said yes. It's going to get hot. The topic will be so intriguing. This energy.
I'm pumped.
Dr. Neal's going to get everybody just. He's wonderful, by the way. Yeah, that's him.
Thank you.
I've been telling him about
Excited to hear you. I'm Julie Opatek. I work with
Julie
I work with Gina. I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. Well, I'm telling you, though, a lot of people had to go home because their kids got let out of school. Our floor is like pretty much crumbling. Yeah. I don't think it's gonna be bad. I looked at my weather. Bill. Throw the shovel over and hope the tornado bust. Yeah, she's got a daughter around my daughter's age. Because we saw each other at the mall. And it's Forever 21, which
My daughter's in the platinum group. Yeah. So
really?
graduating in graduating high school this year. So
Wow. What
I
do you
still can't
Yoda
believe
the
that.
best?
yes, she's been swimming for over Yoda for 8 years.
My daughter's in her 4th year. She swims out of the Durham Y, and she's a silver 1.
Okay.
I
So
still
you-
can't believe that.
So you've spent many a day at the swim meets.
Yes. So she'll be heading to goals soon.
Wow. I just think it's such a great sporting activity.
get started. Is this on? No. Oh, big news. Dr. Tatum, we just confirmed this commissioner. Good. I got an email.
Check, check, check.
Okay, yeah. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm going to read a little bit about Dr. Neal. This is a small portion of what is out there for him, and I was letting him know, and some of you earlier, I knew he was popular. I always knew he was popular. But I found out just how popular in recent visits to, Harris Teeter, Lowe's. People were coming up to me. I hear Dr. Neal's going to be at the DCRI. Well, last night I was talking to my daughter, and she wanted to call me, and I said, well, you can't call me at that time because I'll have a program going on for Black History Month. And she said, oh, yeah, well, what's going on? And I mentioned his name. Oh my God, how can I watch that? You gotta let me know. So he has an audience in Los Angeles now because she's told all of her friends. Yeah. But anyway, I'm just gonna read a little bit so that he can get up here, and I'm sure we have a lot of people streaming who had to go home. Oh, hi Tia, hi baby, I know you're watching. Mark Anthony Neal is Professor of African and African American Studies and the founding director of Duke's Center for Arts, Digital Culture, and Entrepreneurship, where he offers courses on Black masculinity, popular culture, and digital humanities. He is the author of several books, get them, including What the Music Said, Black Popular Music and Black Public Culture, Soul Babies, Black Popular Culture and the Post-Soul Aesthetic, and Looking for Leroy, Illegible Black Masculinities. The 10th anniversary edition of his book, New Black Man, which is the first one I read, and it's just great. Let me cut in and say he was destined to do this work. His initials are MAN, Mark Anthony Neal. I mean, Dr. Neal is co-editor of That's the Joint, the Hip Hop Studies Reader, now in its second edition, and he hosts the video webcast Left of Black, which is produced in collaboration with the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke. He is a frequent guest on NPR, and you can follow him on Twitter at New Black Man. My daughter knew that. Let's welcome Dr. Neal as he presents our inaugural Black History Month lecture. Thank you.
I want to thank Gina Streety for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon, particularly with the storm clouds brewing out there. Let me just say one thing about my name and my initials. My mother very consciously, as I like to describe it, gave me a big-ass name. She gave me those three names, and from the time that I was very little, she encouraged me to embrace those three names. I think it was her kind of way to inspire me to what the name represented. It was a bit of a challenge, but she also wanted to make sure that my initials spelt out man. She did that very consciously. As Ms. Streety just mentioned, you can follow me on Twitter at New Black Man. And if you're on Instagram, you can actually follow me there also at Booker BB Brown. Today's talk is, what if the Greensboro Four had Twitter? Thinking about social justice from the analog to the digital era. So there are a couple of inspirations for my comments today. The first is this figure here. Do any of you know who this is? Who is this?
And it just blinked, but give me a second. I'm not going to come up with it, but yeah.
That young man who is 12 years old is Oliver Wendell Jones. He was a recurring character in the late 1980s comic strip Bloom County, which actually just reappeared a few months ago. And I always think about Oliver Wendell Jones as kind of a patron saint for this moment, because we hear so much talk about there being a racial digital divide. about how black folks, particularly young black folks, are not in touch with emerging technologies. Here you have a 12-year-old African-American boy, Oliver Wendell Jones, who in a comic strip in the late 1980s, this is before Macs, folks are using Macs and not everybody's using IBMs. The cutting edge technology of the moment was a Wang. This is a 12-year-old on his Wang in 1988 who already sees himself as a disruptor. Very often in the comic strip, he's trying to hack into the IRS and other kinds of government files, right? He is very much ahead of the curve. And part of what I'd like to suggest today is that when you think about the ways in which African Americans, black folks have used technology, particularly in the spirit of social justice, very often they do so in very cutting edge ways. I'm also inspired by the relationship that these two men didn't have. This was one of the two occasions that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King physically met. There are many folks who speculate there might have been other instances that we just don't know about. But I often wondered how different their relationship might have been if they would have had access to handheld technology. And if they could cut through all the discourse that described Martin Luther King one way politically and Malcolm X another way politically, right? Very often they were posed as opposites, right? And, it was an attempt to create contentions between the two men and their organizations. We know, of course, that much later in Malcolm X's life, he became much more sensitive to the civil rights movement. We know that, for instance, he goes down to offer help and spiritual support in Selma when Martin Luther King's in jail. But just imagine what it would have been like if they would have been able to just text each other. If Malcolm X is quoted on the radio one day calling the civil rights movement sellouts and handkerchief heads, and you could imagine Malcolm getting on his BlackBerry, sending a text, "Yo, MLK, I know you saw me and you heard me on the radio, but understand, right? That's just me being who I am, right? Because what Malcolm X understood is that his positioning politically made it possible for the federal government to be more willing to negotiate with Martin Luther King, right? He was very conscious of that. So I often wonder what the nature of their relationship might have been had they been able to communicate on a regular basis using social media and handheld technology. So in 2010, a journalist at Slate magazine named Manju wrote an article called "How Black People Use Twitter." And the article is fascinating, and quite fascinating even if you consider the title, because you could substitute how the family dog uses Twitter, how your 3-year-old child uses Twitter. The point of the article, or at least the title, suggested there was some strange and unusual thing that black folks were doing on Twitter. Hence, we have to write an article about how black people use Twitter, as if somehow black people don't use Twitter the way everybody else uses Twitter. But this is the thing. Black folks did, in fact, use Twitter differently than other folks use Twitter. And the root of that is something that we might call fictive kin. Because what researchers figured out is that though the African Americans, black folks at the time only represented about 23% of the total population on Twitter, somehow black folks had this incredible capacity to create hashtags that would go viral. And the folks who were researching social media couldn't figure out how this small percentage of folks could generate hashtags that were so popular. The answer to that, in part, is something that we'll call fictive kin. So I'll give you an example of fictive kin. To some of my white colleagues here today, you are walking across the grounds with one of your African American colleagues. That African American colleague sees another African American colleague, and what happens in that instance, right? If I'm walking past you, I give you a head nod, you give me a head nod, right? This is the critical point, though. I do not know this man. So inevitably, your white colleague will ask, well, how do you know that person, right? And of course, you then go, I don't. And of course, your white colleague is now confused. Fictive kin, this idea that wherever you are, someone who looks like you is potentially kin, right? So it has a kind of fictive quality to it. Why that was important in terms of social media, and particularly thinking about Twitter, is that it meant that African American folks were more willing, A, to follow folks who identified as black, but more importantly, were more willing to retweet things and share information from folks who were also black. So what it created was a social network within social media in which black impact, right, becomes concentrated in a certain way. And this is important because this is not brand new. When we ask the question, what if the Greensboro Four had Twitter, we can think about social media and the birth of social media, at least for African Americans, 100 years ago, 200 years ago on plantations. When we think about social media, we often think about the technology. We don't think about the social in the social media. So field songs, work songs on plantations were forms of social media. It was the ability for African American enslaved Africans to be able to communicate with each other in public spaces, but very often in ways that were coded. So on the one hand, right, overseers are thinking that when they're hearing enslaved Africans sing "Go Down Moses," that somehow they were acquiescing to something else, not understanding that the duality of the message meant that Moses might have been a cave or a field about a quarter of a mile down the road. And when they were singing "Go Down Moses," it was actually a message to each other saying that that field or that cave, maybe we should meet like after dark in that field and that cave so we can plot a way to get up off of this plantation. There's a concept in African American literary practices and rhetorical practices, right? What we understand is the figure of the signifying monkey. Henry Louis Gates, a great scholar at Harvard, wrote a great book in 1988 called The Signifying Monkey. The signifying monkey, who in West Africa is often described as Isu Elegbara. Isu Elegbara, as it's translated in the United States as the signifying monkey, is this figure who can define meaning. And what that meant is that there's always been these practices of double speak, of multiple speak, so that black folks could communicate with each other publicly and take one meaning from that, where other folks who are not part of that rhetorical community or vernacular community do not understand that meaning. So for instance, Branford Marsalis released an album, a blues album in 1992. The title of the album was "I Heard You Twice the First Time." Right? Meaning you said something to me, but I heard multiple meanings. It is something that we understand in the context of African American life and culture as a form of coding. So that when we go to February 1, 1960, and we consider what happens at that lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and very often when we think about that moment and what we see in the aftermath, these four young men from North Carolina A&T decide to sit in to be disruptors, to disrupt the status quo socially of what's happening in the American South. They do it the first day, they come back a second day. What we see over the course of the next 3 weeks in language that we understand now as viral, we see these sit-ins go viral throughout the American South in hundreds of cities. That, of course, leads to the foundation, the creation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, again, right here in the Triangle at Shaw University in April of 1960. But of course, how did that happen? Well, one way we can think about it in reference to someone like Gil Scott-Heron, who would tell us in 1970 the revolution will not be televised, but the revolution will in fact be mimeographed. Because what we have always seen is that in support of social justice, black folks have often used cutting edge technology. In 1960, one of the cutting edge technologies was a mimeograph machine. And most of you in this room are old enough to remember, right? Because when I'm telling this story to my students, right, the Xerox / Hewitt Packard generation, right, they have no idea what a mimeograph machine is, right? And we can remember those days in grade school, right, when our teacher came in with the freshly done mimeograph, and the first thing we did was to get that blue ink high, right? Like you weren't in class, right, if you didn't get that, fresh blue ink, indigo ink high, right, in your class. But in 1960, this was a way for organizers to be able to mass produce information in ways that they hadn't had the opportunity to do also. We also know that, for instance, word of mouth becomes a critical aspect of what we understand as social media. Again, the focus on the social in the social media piece, right? And of course, in 1960, we also had networks of Black-owned radio stations, where it was not unusual for radio station owners to allow access to organizers and civil rights leaders to be able to communicate very directly to Black audiences using the radio. If we go forward to the 1970s and think about what form Black social media might take, we might think about it in the context of this thing called a mixtape. Now, again, for younger generations of folks, most of them don't actually know that a mixtape at one time was an actual tape, right? Not just something you download, right, on iTunes or something of that matter. This, in fact, is a mixtape from Mr. Magic. Mr. Magic was a very popular DJ in New York City in the 1970s and 1980s. He was one of the first DJs in America, for that matter, to play hip hop on radio airwaves, usually on Friday and Saturday nights, and preferably for most of these radio stations after midnight. What's important about thinking about the social media piece is that very often it was not unusual for folks to do air recordings of shows like Mr. Magic and Red Alert. This is hip hop that's being produced in New York, and those cassette tapes would literally circulate, right, regionally and across the West Coast. So when you think about a figure like Andre Young or another figure like O'Shea Jackson, do you know who any of these people are? Andre Young, who, if you know him as Dr. Dre. O'Shea Jackson, who, if you know him, you will know him as Ice Cube. And, I got this running joke. If my name was O'Shea, call me Ice Cube too. Right? Negro walking around Compton named O'Shea. But these, of course, the two founders of an organization, a group called NWA. Right? And of course, they just did a great movie about them over the summer that has an Academy Award nomination released for the screenplay. Dr. Dre, who is now worth $1 billion, worth enough money to give the University of Southern California $70 million, right, to open a school of entertainment and entrepreneurship in his name. But these young men would have heard hip hop in the early 1980s because of cassette tapes like this that would have circulated. I went to school in upstate New York. I was born and raised in New York City in the Bronx. And it wasn't unusual for us to have our semester and then we would come back home for Christmas break. And of course, we'd have all our fresh, empty cassette tapes, and we would record all these radio shows. And when we returned back to school, I went to school in upstate New York and Western New York, we would have these fresh New York cassette tapes, and those would be the tapes that we would listen to at house parties. Right? So it's these subtle kinds of ways in which there was always a media and a technology that Black folks have used to circulate different aspects of the culture. This becomes critically important in the early aughts, specifically 2005, around Hurricane Katrina. So we know that Hurricane Katrina, for instance, occurred in August of 2005. But there was something else that was occurring around that same period of time that made our reaction to Katrina very different than how we had ever reacted to social crisis, or in this case, a natural crisis. A few years earlier, something was introduced to our technology, broadband. Now, every one of you in this room right now has used broadband so much that you take it for granted. But for those of you who remember dial-up internet service, your AOL accounts from the late 1980s, right? There's probably something that you have tried to download on your dial-up service in 1998 that is still downloaded. You can remember those things where one of your friends decided they were going to send you a photo with all this data, and it would take a half an hour for this photo to down, and all the email that was behind that is blocked, right? And of course, what it is a question of is that you have a lot of data, but there's not a lot of space for that data. Broadband, as the term suggests, created a context in which you could have large amounts of data go through and relatively quickly, right? It's what we know from what is Wi-Fi at this moment. Around the same time, a new social media platform occurs that would have been impossible without broadband. Again, something that we take for granted right now, YouTube. right? YouTube is impossible without broadband because you would not have had the technological platform that could crunch all that data in ways. So you think about how difficult it was to get a single photo through your email 15 years ago. Now you're watching whole movies, right? Through these same platforms, right? That's what broadband is about. And YouTube was important because what it created was this new moment of citizen journalism. The ability for individual citizens to be both disruptors, to intervene in conversations, particularly around issues of social justice. One of the first people who takes advantage of this is a guy by the name of Chaotix, the legendary KO, a rapper from Houston, and he creates a video that borrows profusely from other sources to make an interesting commentary about Hurricane Katrina.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
I ain't saying he's a gold digger, but he ain't messing with no broke niggas. I ain't saying he a gold digger, but he ain't messing with no broke niggas. George Bush don't like black people. Yeah, George Bush don't like freshness. George Bush don't like black people. George Bush don't like black people. Hurricane came through, fucked us up round here. Government acting like it's bad luck down here. All I know is that you better bring some trucks round here. Wonder why I got my middle finger up round here. People's lives on the line, you decline in the help. Since you taking so much time, we survive in ourselves. Just me and my pets and my kids and my spouse trapped in my own house looking for a way out.
Tell them that we need to get out of here.
5 days in this motherfucking attic. Can't use the cell phone, I keep getting static. Dying cause they lying instead of telling us the truth. Other day the helicopters got my neighbors off the roof. It's cool cause they said they coming back for us too. That was 3 days ago, I don't see no rescue. See, a man's gotta do what a man's gotta do. Since God made the path, then I'm trying to walk through. Swam to the store trying to look for food. Corner store's kinda flooded, so I broke my way through. I got what I could, but before I got through, the news said police shot a black man trying to loot. Don't like black people. George Bush don't like black people. George Bush don't like black people. George Bush don't like. I ain't saying he a gold digger. He ain't looking for no broke niggas. I ain't saying he a gold digger. He ain't checking for no broke niggas. George Bush don't like black people. George Bush don't like black people. George Bush don't like black people. George Bush don't like black people.
So think about this for a moment. Back in 2005, when everyone is trying to figure out why Katrina happened, why the levees failed, and suddenly you had citizen journalists who could create media that intervened in that conversation. Now, of course, its foundation, of course, is a Kanye West song. And of course, Kanye gets drawn into this for that moment during the telethon where he very uncomfortably says, George Bush doesn't care about black people, right? And Chaotix takes this line and takes a Kanye West song called Gold Digger and creates a whole narrative around that. And that does a couple of things, right? On the one hand, it intervenes in the conversation, but it also intervenes in the conversation in a way that resonates for young folks who are listening to Kanye West. The moment is pure hip hop for a couple of reasons. And quickly, how many of you have ever seen this video? Right. And that's not accidental, right? Because what this video created, which has been the concern with broadband and YouTube since the beginning, are issues of copyright infringement, right? None of the images or even the music that you hear, were given permissions to be used. So first, Chaotix borrows Kanye West's song. And of course, we know that the Kanye West song itself was borrowed from Ray Charles, right? It's Ray Charles's I Got a Woman. That is Jamie Foxx singing the hook, sounding just like Ray Charles as he did in the film that came out 2 years earlier. And this is the thing about hip hop. Hip hop is purely about, on so many levels, borrowing and sampling, right? And creating layers of meanings, right? Like I talked about earlier. What most folks don't know is that Ray Charles himself borrowed the melody and some of the content to I Got a Woman from 2 other existing gospel songs. So I Got a Woman at some point was once I Got Jesus, right? The melody gets borrowed from an existing gospel song, right? And part of it speaks to the genius of who Ray Charles was, right? Because what Ray Charles understood, probably perhaps better than most folks at the time, is that the same folks that were up in the club on Saturday night were the same folks sitting in the pews on Sunday morning, right? So why complicate things, right? Why don't you create a music that speaks to everybody broadly at the same time? What we know is the foundations of soul music, right? And soul music was the secularization of gospel music, right? And of course, think about the role that soul music plays in the 1960s in terms of politically mobilizing people. So that when you hear Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions singing "I'm a Winner," and songs of that nature, right? It's this mixing of these gospel sounds with these very urgent political narratives, right? In ways that were secularized, so everyday folks felt an investment in it. We talked about code, right? This ability for folks to communicate with each other across different populations. So I'm gonna show you this clip, and I will tell you the clip was done around April of 2008. This is when Barack Obama is running for still the Democratic nomination against Hillary Clinton. And he's responding to some of the tactics coming from the Clinton campaign. And so he gives this quick little speech. And of course, the other downside of broadband.
Yeah, that's why she's only airing negative attacks on TV yeah, that's why she's only airing negative attacks on TV in Pennsylvania, like most places. Look, I understand that because that's the textbook Washington game. That's how our politics has been taught to be played. That's the lesson that she learned when the Republicans were doing that same thing to her back in the 1990s. So I understand it, and when you're running for the presidency, then you've got to expect it. And, you know, you've just got to kind of let it. That's what you got to do. That's what you got to do.
So this is where I get to gauge how much some of you are invested in popular culture. How many of you don't know the reference? So the reference is a Jay-Z song called "Dirt on My Shoulder," right? Which is literally about, you know, when things happen, you learn to rub it right. And this was classic because this is Barack understanding the vernacular community that he comes from, both in terms of African American folks, but also in terms of young folks who listen to hip hop. That same young hip hop audience that's critical to his electorate in 2008. So while he never has to mention hip hop, never has to mention Jay-Z, who eventually becomes a surrogate for his campaign, both in 08 and 12, right? He can just make this simple little gesture, and everybody who was supposed to get it, got it. Meanwhile, folks like some of you here, almost a decade later, what? Right? And that's what we mean. And of course, now broadband and social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and YouTube allow for Black audiences to be able to do that in much more sophisticated ways than we've seen in the past. This moment might be defined in terms of the uptick of Black youth activism that we can trace to Katrina, through the Gina 6 case, through the Haitian earthquake, all the way up to things like Black Lives Matter, and the work of researchers like Kathy Cohen, Black political scientist at the University of Chicago, Henry Jenkins, who is kind of like the OG in this work, teaches at USC, and that's Craig Watkins, who teaches at the University of Texas at Austin. And the work that they do might be described as spreadable resistance and shareable revolutions. And some of the things that they've recognized in their research collectively, what we might think of as freedom dreams, is at first what we see amongst young folks are acts that are interactive, shareable, or per Jenkins spreadable. Jenkins had this problem with the idea of calling things viral because it made it sound like, it was a sickness, right, or disease or something, right? He liked the idea, the metaphor, or spreadable, right, like peanut butter, right, stuff that sticks, right, but is spread to wide audiences. They also talk about the fact that much of the activity between young folks are peer-based. They go on to talk about how it is not guided by deference to elites or formal institutions, and we all understand what we've seen the last couple of years. These are young folks who are organizing and not asking for permission from traditional civil rights organizations, not asking for traditional media to wait to cover stories. They're doing this all of their own. 4, it's meant to address issues of public concerns, particularly for young folks. 5, not solely defined by forms of social media and digital technology, right? This is a point that folks miss, but is very critical. Most of the young folks who engage in social media activism were already doing activism. Social media just allowed them a different set of technologies to be able to do what they were doing already. 6, social media networks allow youth to access and mobilize large networks to amplify issues of concern to them, a digital counterpublic. So to give you one example, that when Trayvon Martin was killed, and of course, the activity that we see the month after that leads into these hoodie marches where hundreds of thousands of folks show up in New York City wearing hoods. Everyone took selfie photos that they posted on social media of themselves in hoodies. Even the Miami Heat, right, did a photo with their one white ball player, one white teammate, right, all wearing their hoodies in solidarity. One of the ways that we see that this occurred is because all kinds of social networks became activated. And my favorite story from this moment is the Harry Potter group, right? So a group of like 300,000 folks, right, who are connected on social media around Harry Potter, once the leader of that organization voiced some concern about what happened to Trayvon Martin, he was able to activate many of the people in his social network, many of which who obviously aren't black, right, to be engaged in this form of activism. And then 7, this is Craig Watkins talking about what broadband did, as we were just talking, was to expand a relatively small collection of early adopting technophiles into a massive but highly differentiated public of netizens, world builders, bloggers, gamers, social networkers, and content creators. And I love the inclusion of gamers, right? Because some of you might have children that are gamers, right? And of course, you're sitting around thinking that all they're doing is sitting around playing all kinds of crazy games, not taking into account that very often these gaming practices are helping them to develop a particular skill set around technology that when they actually get connected to issues of social justice, the talents and the skills that they learned in terms of gaming then get applied to their work in social justice, right? So none of this work is useless, particularly once they get activated into thinking about issues of social justice. And so one of the critical moments, what I will call the moment of a paradigm shift, occurred in August of 2013. August of 2013, of course, there was a hugely orchestrated anniversary to the March on Washington, right? August 1963. MSNBC covered it like all day, right? It was like an official event. It was a big deal because unlike the March on Washington in 1963, in 2013, the Attorney General of the United States was going to speak at the march, right? That is some sort of interesting measurement of the kinds of shifts. So amongst the folks who were expected to speak, one of them was a gentleman by the name of Philip Agnew. Philip Agnew helped to found an organization when he was a college student called the Dream Defenders. The Dream Defenders were one of the most visible organizations to emerge after the death of Trayvon Martin. And he had been collaborating for some time with a woman by the name of Sophia Campos, who is part of the generation of dreamers thinking about immigration reform. So they were both scheduled to speak for 2 minutes at the March on Washington. This person went a little long, this person went a little long. They were told, you won't be able to speak, even for those 2 minutes. So Philip Agnew went, bet, got a cameraman, found a little spot where he could record his 2-minute speech while in fact encouraging other people to do the same. And this is what he said in his speech.
My name is Philip Agnew, Executive Director of the Dream Defenders. And this morning, my time as well as that of Sophia Campos, leader of United We Dream, was cut from the march. But we still have much to say. They told me that they had run out of time, but I believe that our time is now. What do you believe? Record a video. Let your voice be heard. This is our dream. The America of today we inherited, but the America of tomorrow is ours. The world is ours. So please record your 2 minutes. What would you say with your 2 minutes? Record it, post it, and use the hashtag #OurMarch so that we can share with the world what our generation has to say about the future of America and the dream. Whenever you're ready. By the time we finish our conversation this morning, another black boy will lay bleeding in the streets of Chicago. And as we rest our heads tonight, 300,000 of our veterans will lay their heads homeless. And I would love to explain to you how the hate we spread abroad is the real reason that hatred washes upon our shores, but I only have 2 minutes. And I can tell you that Philadelphia just closed 23 of its schools. At the same time, it makes way for a $400 million state-of-the-art prison, and that North Carolina and Florida continue to silence their citizens at the ballot box, but I only have 2 minutes. I can tell you how even as we celebrate Dr. King's dream, over 400,000 of our immigrant brothers and sisters languish away in privately owned detention camps, and how we still find our queer brothers and sisters in prison in the shadows of their closets, but I only have 2 minutes. And I tell you how our mothers, sisters, wives, and daughters still earn less, have no control over their bodies, and are traded and trafficked like slaves. And I can tell you how it's easier for someone to buy a gun and put it to their head than it is to diagnose the illness within it, but I only have 2 minutes. And if there was time, I'd tell you that millions of young people and queer people and poor people and people of color are asking, what do we do with all this anger, all this fear, this disappointment and frustration, this mad that we feel? But alas, I only have 1 minute. And with it, this last minute of our conversation, I tell you that though all may seem lost, that there is a generation of dreamers and lovers and defenders and builders bubbling, bubbling, bubbling beneath the rubble. And beneath your feet, you may feel a collective quaking, tremors of a sleeping giant awakening, emanating from fault lines at the Arizona-Mexico border, and Raleigh, and in Austin, and in Cleveland, Ohio, and Chicago, Illinois, and even Tallahassee, Florida. And we've come here from every crack, crease, and crevice of our country to our capital to say that for all those whose cares have been our concern, we're ready. To say that anybody that believes will be co-opted, oh, we will not be bought, and we're ready. And for those that doubt our energy and our resolve and our discipline, we're ready. For those that believe that future fingers may fail the torch, fear not, we're ready. For all those that believe in the power of nonviolence and love as unconquerable, we are ready. For 50 years ago, a man told us of a promised land. And for 50 years, we've wandered and wondered, where are the youth, the constant whisper in our ears? And so we have come asking neither permission nor questions, but to answer one and say that we are here, believing indeed that we have a beautiful history, and the one that we will build in the future will truly astonish the world. We're ready. May the outcome always prosper over income, peace over profit, revolution over revenue, and all peace and power to the people. For anybody that doubts us, don't believe us, just watch. We're ready.
No one remembers any of the speeches that were given at the 2013 anniversary of the March on Washington. Millions of young folks have watched this YouTube video since that march. What it represented was the moment, the significant critical paradigm shift in how young black folks would engage social media and social justice. We've been hearing narratives about how apathetic young folks were in this country. It's not that they were apathetic, it's that their mode of organizing was different than what we had seen before. So it's not surprising that very shortly after that, we start to see some shifts in what might be described by Craig Watkins as the mobile diaspora. And by mobile, we're talking about handheld mobile devices. Watkins writes in his book, The Young and the Digital, social and mobile media platforms have emerged as the dominant technology in young people's lives. They have not known a world without computers and software capable of handling multiple tasks at the same time. From their view of the world, the computer has always been what one research group calls a multitasking hub. And very often when we see our young folks multitask, we read their ability to multitask based on our inability as adults to multitask, right? Because our ability to multitask is premised on us learning new skills. Young folks only know a world where they multitask, right? So this is like as perfectly organic and natural to them. So that when you read Gardner and Davis's book, and I love the title, The App Generation, they've come to think of the world as an ensemble of apps, or perhaps in many cases, a single extended cradle to grave app. And if no app can be imagined or devised, then the desire simply does not matter. So what's an app for social change? When Mike Brown is killed in 2014, we start to see this bubbling up of hashtags. And hashtags are critical because hashtags allow for us to index information, big data, if you will, through Twitter. The top left, you see photos of students at Howard University showing their solidarity for what was supposed to be the last gesture of Mike Brown. To the right, you see members of the St. Louis Rams, the wide receivers and the tight end, the folks who run fast, showing a gesture of solidarity. I think it's important to remember that the St. Louis Rams are in the process of moving out of St. Louis at the moment. And then at the bottom, it's the cast of Ava DuVernay's film, Selma, both with their hands up, but also with T-shirts wearing I Can't Breathe in reference to the choking death of Eric Garner. In the immediate time after Mike Brown was killed, they began to circulate a hashtag called If They Gunned Me Down. And it was in response to the fact that some of the early photos of Mike Brown that circulated in the mainstream media were photos that, if we were trying to build a narrative, were photos that kind of confirmed the narrative of what we heard who Mike Brown was, right, or supposed to have been. And young black folks immediately understood that it seemed deliberate that they were trying to find photos of Mike Brown that would criminalize him. So not the photo of him in his graduation outfit, but other kinds of photos. And so they began to circulate a meme and a hashtag called If They Gun Me Now, which on the one hand is them intuitively understanding that the mainstream media does not see the humanity of young folks. So if they themselves would get shot, it would not be photos of them in the uniform of respectability, but it would be some other kinds of photos. And the thing that I loved about this moment is that it also was a critique of mainstream corporate media. So when I sit down and do a phone interview with Tanzina Vivega, who at the time was writing for the New York Times the next day, the New York Times was covering a story about this hashtag. And let me be more explicit. The New York Times was doing a story on how they failed to cover the story and had to respond to the critique of their coverage by young black folks using social media, right? This is how we know the game had changed. That suddenly what was driving corporate media's interest in these stories were things that were occurring in terms of young folks using the hashtags and memes in social media that are now changing the narrative, or in their mind, attempting to correct the narrative. Black Lives Matter is something that emerges out of this moment, right? And again, it starts as a hashtag, a way to be able to organize and index information. And so when we think about this, and what you have on the left are the three women who founded Black Lives Matter: Elisa Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi. Patrisse Cullors was here at Duke in the fall. You have photos of Harvard University medical centers, medical students who are themselves showing solidarity at the moment. The reference there of every 28 hours is research that was done by the Malcolm X grassroots organization, that research that said that basically every 28 hours, someone of color is killed, extra legal violence by the police. And what you see out of these hashtags are, one, the indexing of breaking news, emerging information. If something's happening, you want to find out what happens, find out where the hashtag is, and it'll give you some sense of where it's happening on the ground. Hashtags allow you to build community. Hashtags have forced media coverage and accountability to mainstream media. It's been used to do mobilization, cross-racial social justice, and of course the question that we're wondering now, will this activism lead to very real policy change? Rhythm and creative spirit, Black feminist education, politics, curated Black intellectuals. For those of us who work in the academy like myself, the challenge is, what are the ways that we can contribute to this moment? And so for my work, for instance, it's about thinking about how do we translate the work of Black studies, the research to Black studies, to a generation of folks who need information on handheld devices. I was a relatively late adopter to Twitter, which for me meant around 2010. And I joined Twitter solely because I had Duke alums, students who had taken my classes, who said quite frankly to me, we want to continue the kinds of discussions we had in your class on Twitter. Why don't you join Twitter? I can say now 6 years and 40,000 followers later, the majority of the work that I do on Twitter is about pedagogical concerns. Because what Twitter represents, whether it's Black Twitter or some sort of other iteration, is a hunger for information. And as scholars, we cannot foreclose the possibility of making our work accessible to folks who are there, because in the absence of the right information or good information, people will happily consume bad and wrong information. So one of the ways we've attempted to address this in our small little part of the world is a weekly web series that I host and is produced by the John Hope Franklin Center here at Duke. Specifically, it's Catherine Angst, who for the last 6 years, we've been doing the show for 6 years. We've done over 200 segments. The clip that you're going to see is our 3rd season promo to give you a kind of sense of the kind of work that we do about it. We've been very proud of this work because it's an opportunity for us to take folks who are doing amazing work in our field and be able to have it accessible to folks. So folks can access it for free on YouTube. You can access it in HD at iTunes University for free. And my favorite story about, what the show has meant for me at least, we did an episode with Cornel West, this is about 4 years ago, at a church in Raleigh. Long episode, one of our most popular episodes. I was at KFC. I don't really go to KFC anymore. At least I'm going to let you believe that at the moment. KFC is not good for you. But I went to KFC, and of course, there was some sort of delay in something that I had asked for, so they asked me to pull off to the side. A young African-American man comes out with my food. Because at the time, when we first did Left of Black, we also made it accessible on local access television here. He had seen the Cornel West episode on local access television, and he comes out and sees me and goes, I know you. I love that Cornel West episode, right? And that was important to me because particularly at a place like Duke, we get caught up in the kind of echo chamber that's the institution. I've always believed that we need to teach beyond the 4 walls. How do we take the work that we do in these institutions and make them available to broader publics? While I was too old to be around, or too young to be around at the beginning moments of the Black Studies movement, what the Black Studies movement was always about is how do you use the resources of the university to impact upon the social good of folks who will never set foot at the university. And that's what we've tried to do a little bit with Left of Black. So I'll show you this quick clip, and then I'll take some questions. What is Left of Black? Rhythm and creative spirit, Black feminist education, politics, curated Black and Left of Black is Left of Black.
I feel like most people recognize that there's an importance to a lot of the artists in my collection these days, but when I started back in the mid-90s, it was very out of fashion to be collecting identity art.
Learning the song after I feel that spark is also about learning the spark. Like, what is it that grabbed me about the song? And sometimes
I want to see on the screen the people I know and recognize and love the way I see them.
I really care about craft and style. Like those, as a reader, which I consider myself a world-class reader.
It's clear that what we're seeing is a generational shift in terms of the leadership of African American studies programs and departments and centers around the country.
People are scared of talking about culture. Once you start talking about culture and education, it sort of calls for this idea of looking at race issues, class issues, gender issues, and people don't like to talk about those issues. But I would argue that that's the one thing that we haven't focused on yet. And so teaching a new way means teaching with an exclusive, explicit focus on culture.
They want to get African Americans on tape saying negative things about Obama. I don't know why.
On the BET Awards, there's a Palestinian flag wrapped around his microphone, Occupy t-shirt, and Erykah Badu and a burqa behind him singing the chorus. So, yeah, things are changing, but that's 2011 for you,
But the idea that in a democracy we will be accurately seen for who we are in the public sphere, that there's actually a human pleasure that comes from engaging in the public sphere and having people look at us and accurately see who we are.
To the blackness of my bra, off the Porchy words with Felicia Rashad, black lashes, all black, they used to make them all the macaroons, I rely on the lips for all my brothers and their mothers, black pics me stay ahead of this in black, my book bag me did, cause Rhapsody has got your back.
Couple of quick things about the clip. The first person you see is Dr. Ken Montague, who is a dentist from Toronto, but is one of the largest has one of the largest collections of black art in the world. He was here at the Nasher on an exhibition that was based on his art holdings. We had, in the last part of the clip, Melissa Harris Perry, right, who of course hosts a show on MSNBC on Saturday mornings. We taped that show a week before she launched that show in February of 2012. You also saw the head of Black Studies at Princeton University and Eddie Glaude. You saw the filmmaker, Julie Dash, who of course did the great film about South Carolina, Daughters of the Dust. And my favorite part about this is that the music that you hear is a young black woman from Snow Hill, North Carolina. Her name is Rhapsody. She is signed to a label called Jamla. Jamla is run by a gentleman by the name of Patrick Douthit. Patrick Douthit is known around this area and in the industry as a gentleman by the name of Ninth Wonder. Ninth Wonder and I co-teach a class called the History of Hip Hop on Wednesday nights this semester. We have 125 plus students. But we asked Rhapsody to do our theme song. It's a song called All Black Everything. No one really knew who Rhapsody was in 2012 when we started using that song as part of our theme. In 2016, Rhapsody was at the Grammy Awards where she won part of a Grammy Award because she was one of the contributors to Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. So, we're kind of proud to have been cutting edge in that regard. But thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out. And if you have any questions, let's chat a little bit. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
So I like your use of the turned around monitor screen as opposed to having to fly your people in and do this in person.
Yeah, we sat down and thought about it, and it really came out of, I did an interview with AOL back in 2010, and that's how we did the interview. And I knew I needed to use a computer, and I wasn't sure at the time that my computer had a camera that worked well. So I asked around, and the folks at Duke News and Communications, I was like, do you have like a Skype studio? And they had just bought this equipment and just set up this studio, so we did the interview. This is July 2010. And I remember looking at a few folks at Duke News and Communication, and Camille Jackson, who was working with Duke News and Communications at the time, and going, we can do this ourselves. So we reached out to the John Hope Franklin Center, and the whole idea of being able to use Skype, have a big monitor so as if the person is sitting next to you, and it allowed us access to a world of folks. When I was beginning as a graduate student back in '93, the biggest thing were all these black public intellectuals, bell hooks, the late Manning Marable, Mike Eric Dyson, Cornell West. We all went into graduate school at the time wanting to be superstars like them. And of course, what we all were hoping for was the day that we would get on Charlie Rose, right? That was going to be the pinnacle, right? To get on Charlie Rose. Somewhere around 2010, I'm like, okay, I still ain't been on Charlie Rose. All right, but I can do my own version of Charlie Rose. And so the idea to be able to identify folks who are doing great work around African American studies, and not just black scholars, right, and not just scholars here in the United States, but folks who are doing great work, and create a nice little space for them to talk about their work in ways that PBS is not going to pay attention, or NPR might not pay attention, but they get a chance to talk about their work in a very comfortable and informal way. You know, the whole idea is that we're having conversations that are acceptable, you know, to everyday kinds of folks, right? I've always said that, you know, when I began my work as a scholar, you know, my father, you know, who I pay a lot of tribute to in the work that I do, particularly around music, my father dropped out of school in 10th grade. He was a functional illiterate, somehow managed to navigate New York City for about 40 years without basically being able to read signs, right? But I always talk about my father as my first interlocutor, right? He was the person who gave me a passion for intellectual thought. So I always wanted to make sure I did work that was accessible to folks like my father, but more importantly, you know, had some meaning to folks like my father, right? Had real everyday kind of value and meaning to them. So that's what we've tried to do with the show. The hope is as we go forward, that now that we have this huge archive, that we're actually be able to take bits and pieces of that archive and actually translate it into secondary curriculum, right? So that folks have questions, you know, young high school students have questions about some sort of part of Black history, they'd be able to do a search and be able to pull up one of the clips that we've done, you know, over these last 6 years. Again, the idea of taking the resources of the university and making them accessible and available to a broader public who can never really even imagine being in some of these spaces. The same goes for the teaching. The hip hop class at 9th 1 that I teach is actually open to the public. So if you ever want to come through 6:15, the White Lecture Hall on Wednesday nights, come on through. Yes, ma'am.
So what you're saying about accessibility, and I feel like there's, not only are there people out there who can't access this research that you're, you know, sharing with you because of those walls, but those same people, there's a lot of people out there who are hungry for that information, right? And they just don't have the means. So I'm wondering if you have other stories like your KFC one where you've seen that kind of connection or impact, and what that kind of, what that seems like.
I'm always hearing colleagues who use episodes in the classroom, you know, who are doing even sometimes random searches on some information, and an episode will come up and they'll find ways to discuss it there. We did, and this was really the moment where I started to adopt Twitter. The first year that 9th 1 and I taught the class, we live streamed one of the classes. And it was a class in which we focused specifically on Nas's groundbreaking album Illmatic, right? And so it's myself, 9th Wonder, James Braxton Peterson, who's a Duke Trinity alum, 1993, and now runs Black Studies at Lehigh. So we're having this kind of conversation about Nas's work that we broadcast live, and we had the back channel on Twitter and all this stuff. And a student sent me an email saying that he was on the fence about whether or not he wanted to come to Duke. He was looking at a couple of institutions. He saw this conversation, right? And that conversation helped him make the decision to come to Duke. And you know, for me, it was of value because this is the kind of stuff that Duke admissions folks aren't thinking about, right? What are the other ways in which they attract students? And it's the same kind of rolling out the same kind of ideas to be able to attract students. And the students are just simply different now. The class that we teach this semester, about 60% of the students are white, right? A good, healthy portion of the students are not Trinity students, but in fact, Pratt engineering students, right? It creates a totally different dynamic in the classroom for folks who love hip hop. And it's not as if we spend a whole semester talking about whether or not Jay-Z is better than Nas or Lil Wayne is better than Drake. We actually use hip hop as a way to talk about the Great Migration, African-American rhetorical practices. We're about to read a book called Hip Hop and Obama that talks about what hip hop has looked like in the Obama era. The idea is to use something that students find accessible and to use it to challenge them to think about other things. Yes?
You just addressed part of what my question was. I do not tweet. I've never liked the idea of what I picture as being merely a delivery system. And so I'm intrigued by your saying that it represents a hunger for information. Can you talk more about how people receive those sort of bulletins that come out through?
So there are a couple of ways to think about, Twitter is really a sharing space. You build social capital on Twitter by sharing other people's information, right? And if you do that, if you show that kind of ethic, right, folks will return that ethic in their kind of sharing practices. We often get caught up in thinking about the 40-character piece of Twitter, right? What can we say in 140 characters? But so much of the power of Twitter is not that, but the sharing of links, right? You just read a great New York Times article, put it out on Twitter, right? So it's not even just your own ideas, right? But stuff that you have, information that's of value that you have access to, right? Being willing to share that, right? So, again, folks get caught up in, I need to say something in 140 characters. No, you don't. You can if you have something to say. More importantly is if you have information to share, right? And Twitter is driven by the sharing of that information. But there are also other kinds of moments on Twitter, right? If you follow Twitter feeds when Real Housewives of Atlanta are on, the Twitter exchanges about what folks are watching on the television show sometimes are more interesting than anything that's occurring in the actual television show. Why it's been of incredible value is that, for instance, if you watch Scandal on Thursday night, or if you watch Being Mary Jane, on Tuesday nights, you get this interesting generational young black women, middle-aged black women, older black women who are all watching the same show, who are now crowdsourcing a conversation about what they're watching. And this was something that was unimaginable without this kind of platform, right? The fact is you could have 100,000 people watching a show at the same time that then can communicate with each other. In some ways affirm some things, right? You can get older folks kind of challenging choices. I mean, it becomes a rich space to think about, in the case of, say, shows like Scandal or Being Mary Jane, it gives a rich space to think about the lives of black women, in that particular context. Yes.
You can stick around and ask your questions, but I know some people have to go because of the time. But please stick around and ask your questions. Thank you for coming.
Yes, ma'am.
I had a quick question. I think something interesting that a term that I've been hearing recently. I was an undergrad at Duke. I just graduated and I'm working here now as a clinical trials assistant. Is public scholar. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's it kind of begs the question of as opposed to what a private scholar. And if you're putting information out there, I mean, we all are involved in studies and projects where you're pumping out so much information and some of it is so important for patients and just people, the entire global population. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on, or the responsibility of medical institutions and kind of academic fields outside of, the university or the undergraduate university in terms of being public and being accessible with their information?
I think if there's information that's of value to the public, you think about multiple delivery systems. For some of your patients, that's going to be the flyer in the mail. It might be a phone call, right? It might be a robocall. It might be just simply an email. But for some of your patients, it might be social media, right? If we're talking about older folks, the tendency will be more Facebook, which also includes much more information. For younger folks, it might be Twitter, right? But I think you just, as an organization, institutions in general, develop multiple ways to deliver information, right? There's still folks who prefer email, which is always kind of striking to me because can you send it to me in email? It's like, why would I do that, right? But there's still folks and think about, because I know a lot of times when folks think about social media, they get worried about, well, this is going to take over my life. And these are the same things we heard 20 years ago when folks first got email, right? And you figured out a way to seamlessly integrate email into your everyday, both personal and professional lives. I think, social media is the same way. So the same way that companies and institutions learned how to send mass emails a decade ago to be able to reach the broadest audience possible, I think there is both a responsibility and a need for medical institutions in this case to do that kind of work, particularly if it's information that's going to be of importance and dramatically, in the best case of the situation, alter the quality of the life for some of your patients, right? Because not everybody can make it in, right? There are other ways to be able to reach folks. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.